When you look at the philosophical spectrum, the debate about animal rights sits at the very top with human ethics and morality. Our moral intuition is one that can't let our philosophical minds wriggle without thinking about the moral capacity of our actions to non-human yet sentient animals. For years, we've tried to put sense and order on how animals ought to be treated through the usage of our moral codes, which suddenly lack a common consensus on absolute right and wrong. Regardless of all that, we have learned that a right moral code should go beyond the beholder's scope in trying to make a right decision. This, as you have known, is the epitome of rational moral understanding. Since animals can suffer, they then have a moral right to be excused of pain. Speciesism, as defined and coined by Richard D. Ryder as the prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of the members of one's own species and against those of the others, counters the moral exclusion of animal pain and mistreatment by placing the human species at the very top of cognition in the animal kingdom. Speciesists assume that such cognitive capacity not only gives them a gap to treat animals as they please, but also excuses them from a moral obligation of protecting them. This video then seeks to put a resolve on what drives human exclusivity to other species beyond divine rights or egalitarianism. It is therefore an urgent matter of importance to be clear that speciesism as a school of thought didn't rise in the 1970s, but it's in this era that the term was coined by Richard D. Ryder to accurately fit within the academic shelf. But again, before we proceed, it's important to understand that the moral ground on which I encompass this view is one which dictates that not only should our moral actions be able to capture the moral pains of those beyond our conscious selves, but also extend to replicating and relating both physically and emotionally on the suffering of those not us. Where this fails, any moral action risks lacking relatability and comprehension from those outside its course. This is what anti-speciesism misses, as I'm going to explain. Most anti-speciesists tend to defend their ideals for animal rights by comparing cognitive capacity of various animals and that of humans. In so doing, they aim at raising a specific degree of empathy from the tormentors of non-human animals. Something in all attempts triggers an opposite reaction contrary to the intentions of the anti-speciesist. But why is it so? It seems to answer that question we ought to track to the origins of this school of thought. This, I think, will give us an insight on what the fundamental aspects of speciesism are. One of the earliest unrecorded efforts of anti-speciesism date back to Jeremy Bentham, the 18th English century philosopher. One of the earliest unrecorded efforts of anti-speciesism date back to Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century English hedonistic utilitarian philosopher, who in his work An Introduction to the Principles of Moral Legislation famously remarked that a being's capacity for suffering, not their ability to reason and talk, is the vital measure for moral consideration. By comparing sentient non-human animals to human infants, Jeremy Bentham establishes a reasoning that both the human baby and an animal differ from an adult human being when it comes to cognitive capacity, something which speciesists use as a justification for their treatment on non-human animals. This then aims to establish a belief that difference in physical capacity doesn't justify moral inequalities. While this form of argument is true, it, like all other arguments against speciesism, misses the fundamental properties of organisms which are deeply driven by survival which erases the strongest of morals. Now, it's totally barbaric to justify immoral behavior on the account of survival. That leads to more serious problems. However, it is civil to understand that the pleasuristic needs of any being, whether good or bad, can't be corrected by criticizing the pleasure they accord to that being, but by the amount of damage they cause to the fellows of that being. For that damage to be quantified or to count, it must then be relatable and replicable to the other species of exact, not merely similar biological terms regardless of their differences in physical traits like skin and gender. What I mean here is that for any moral action to count within society, it must be relatable and replicable to all other members of the human community, regardless of their physical differences like skin and gender. The damage must cut across to the emotional and conscious experience of those species. This remains true even when a member of that species no longer subscribes to a similar biological terms as the members of a species cluster, for example when someone goes mentally insane or when they acquire a serious terminal illness. It is so because we can relate and imagine consequences of their condition consciously and emotionally through equal proportion. It is for this reasoning that social justice exists. It is because the harms of social injustice to the human race are relatable and replicable to fellow humans, thus evoking empathy. This is why we can jail a person for selling a piece of bread but excuse a mob from doing so. We thereupon subject it to a punishment outside our empathy mirror, like poisoning or even traps. The fact that a being can suffer, therefore it has to acquire more rights, is totally true but totally incompatible with our social cognition as human species, for we can't imagine in equal proportion what it is to die from poisoning as a rat. We can relate to death, but not in equal proportion as a rat does. We simply can't evaluate the proportion of pain and suffering inflicted on it or its rat friends. This is what anti-speciesism misses, and to make things work for the anti-species, the non-human animals too have no respect for those outside their niche, should they pose to be significant for their needs, and neither do they promise to do so. This is furthermore justified by the anti-species turn to plants as the alternative sources of utility. It is because plants don't exhibit pain, therefore they should suffer, the anti-species says. To put it simply, since you can't perceive pain, therefore it is no wrong for me to torture you. But I'm not you, and I rely on my senses to deduce your pain. So how will I then understand and respect your sentience if I can't relate to it? So in an anti-species world, suffering is justifiable for a cognito-insensitive person. This is a person who cannot feel pain. This is not a critique of anti-speciesism in particular, but it seeks to highlight the limitation it imposes on itself as a school of thought. It is not good to subject animals to severe pain during experimentation, especially where the benefit to humanity isn't direct or even needed. We must assess what is always at stake before we subject an animal to pain. However, framing such moral attempts as speciesist only provokes defense from the tormentor, not contemplation of their actions. We need to understand that it is in no future, unless by the influence of a scientific tide, will we be able to feel joy in equal proportion as a fly when it feasts on feces. Discrimination has somewhat reduced in the modern age because we have changed our social lens. We have always learned to relate and imagine the consequences of our discrimination on those we persecute, and thus we peer through the line governing our discrimination and accept our fellows as equals. In social fields like gender, where this is still a problem, we still have trouble in curbing discrimination. Though in communities where we are able to mentally shapeshift to the discriminated parties, patriarchy is going extinct. Anti-speciesism, like communism, seeks to change the moral behavior of humans, not their social structure or lens, and that's why it fails. If anti-speciesism has to get anything right, it must not do so through the ability to suffer, but extend beyond and the ability to replicate and relate to the suffering of animals in equal proportion as we do with humans, which I guess lays outside our social structures for now. If you are interested in such conversations, endeavor to subscribe and hit the notification bell.